Excellent. So we've got the technology bit done. So we would like to ask for feedback on the webinar as well for Lucy, and so we can offer even better webinars. So look out for the QR code, which we'll put up on a slide towards the end. Quick introduction to us if you don't know us before we get into the conversation. A little bit about McKinney HR. This slide's got an overview of what we do, so you know who we are and where we are if you need us at any time. And our mission is to create environments where people and teams thrive. And our services are split between HR support, resolving conflict, and improving workplaces through organisation design, training and culture reviews. So our contact email is on this slide if you wish to contact us after the webinar. So I want to introduce Lucy. I'm delighted to be joined by you today, Lucy, and you're a Cultural Intelligence Master Facilitator. And you're working with leaders and organisations to help them navigate cultural differences, and that strengthens collaboration and build more inclusive workshops. So that feeds into what we are interested here at McKinney HR. So it's brilliant to have you today. We've got some points just to introduce Lucy on the screen there. So in 2023, you began interviewing cultural intelligence practitioners and experts from around the world. And that was to explore how CQ is being applied in real organisational settings. And you've brought that together now into a book, which is launched back in November, I think it was. Yeah. And that shares practical examples of how cultural intelligence can support leadership, international effectiveness and inclusion. So it's great to have you with us today, Lucy. And we also welcome questions for Lucy in the chat box. I've obviously got my questions for you. And Lindsay will keep an eye on any of the audience questions for us. So we always do a little bit of a spotlight on the topic before we go into the conversation. And I have shared some points on there. You'll see it's quite sparse. And that's because it's a bit of a new topic for us as well. So we're all learning from you today, Lucy. So this is just a high-level introduction before we delve into the conversation and learn from you. I've got a definition up there. So cultural intelligence refers to the ability to work and communicate effectively across different cultural contexts. So all the words make logical sense. So having spoken to you, Lucy, you mentioned the concept was introduced in Singapore first, and you'll see up on the screen there a couple of researchers there. And we're familiar with IQ and EQ, and cultural intelligence sits alongside those. I've mentioned on the screen there that the framework has 4 elements: drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. So today our focus is exploring the link between cultural intelligence, HR, and leadership. And you'll see from the examples on the last bullet point on the screen that it touches on so many areas. So we'll get into those during the conversation. So very simply, just 4 points there, but lots to go into. This just gives a summary of what we'll cover in the conversation with Lucy. So using it as a practical workplace skill, having better conversations and strengthening leadership behaviours, which is a really nice lead on from our last webinar. And then using cultural intelligence to improve decision making, and then linking it to HR processes as well. So we'll start the conversation. I'll get rid of my slides just now. And then it's just the 2 of us now. So yeah, starting with the concept, Lucy. So you've spent a lot of time speaking with experts around the world about cultural intelligence. So for those of us who are new to the concept, how would you explain cultural intelligence in a practical sense, and why is it becoming so important for organisations today?
Thank you, Rona, and I'm delighted to be here. And I wonder if I could start that answer by asking a question of our participants, our listeners. If you could share in chat a word that you would use to describe or explain culture. So we're talking about cultural intelligence. That word culture is sneaked in. So could you please share a word? And I know that we've got lots of really intelligent people who will be saying a word is not enough. But, just share a word or two or three if you feel you need to go there into chat. Thank you. We've got some coming in. Heritage norms. Oh, it's the way we do things here. Yeah, I'm sure we've heard that often with a shrug of the shoulders. It's just the way we do things here. Um, the vibe, like that word, Jessica. Yeah, the stories people tell. What are the stories that shape, that frame us, that we go to, our shared values? People, absolutely. Cultural intelligence is about people. Although at the moment, I'm beginning to think that AI is possibly another cultural frontier that we need to bring cultural intelligence to. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you, George. Lives, yes, how we live, our interpretations, how we interpret those lives. Thank you. And what you see if you look at those words, our norms, our heritage, everything that's gone before, values, how we do things around here, instantly we see how much complexity is packed into that word culture. It's full of complexity. If we started to think we could spend a day thinking, what do we mean by values? Or what are our norms and where did they come from? And I think that's often why people don't really unlock and think too much about culture because it's like opening a can of worms because there's so much packed into it. So at one level, what I would say cultural intelligence is a tool for navigating that complexity. Cultural intelligence is about people. It's always about people. McKinney HR is about people. It's about the people and interacting and communicating well with them. If any of us remember the 1990s, we may remember the millennium bug when there was a fear that any system that relied on computers would stop when the year 2000 because computers wouldn't recognize that date. And in some way, I'm not sure exactly how, Sun Ang at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, she was involved in that. And what struck her is that it was often the best minds in their field, in the regions coming together. And yet, when they came together, they were often not as good as the sum of their parts. It was kind of, has a decision been reached? Whose role is it to take something forward? And I'm quite sure many of us have experienced that within organizations. You're thinking things just aren't gelling. We're not getting things done that we feel we should get done. And it got Sunang very interested in that layer of culture, which is what she began to look at. And Rona had said it's like it comes on from IQ and EQ, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. Sunang, when she did her studies, she discovered there was over 200 models for intercultural competency, for example, which could fuse and mix things like personality, capability, attitude, all sorts of different things in different combinations. Looking at the theory of intelligences, IQs, our ability to think, but people in the 60s, like Sternberg and Detterman, started to go, what about if we can only think, but with no motivation or ability to use our thinking, are we really intelligent? So they came up with that construct of multifaceted intelligences, of which EQ is the most well known in the UK, and CQ is rooted in that theoretical framework of the four capabilities that Sunang discovered, the four capabilities that are consistently high in people and organizations that are successful in our multicultural and globalized world. And that's drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. That was quite a long answer, Rona.
There is quite a lot in that. And it's maybe a useful reminder for the audience that we will issue after the webinar some key facts. And so don't worry if you're not picking everything up. We've got the recording and we'll also send out some information from Lucy as well. But that's a really good starter. And then I guess moving from theory into practice. So, in your experience, from what you've seen, where do cultural assumptions most commonly show up in everyday workplace interactions? So, it could be management conversations or team communication. You mentioned the team just not quite gelling.
Lots of ways I could go with this question, and I thought I'll just focus on that word communication because it's always what we're doing. And I love the quote, I think it's attributed to George Bernard Shaw, that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So what I hear often, even just listen to my husband when he comes home from work, is I told them, I told them this. And I'm sure lots of us have said that or heard that, the bit about somebody not hearing or not having been able to receive how you shared information. And I think this became very alive for me. I was once working with leaders in an oil and gas company, and we had a series of very short training sessions, maybe 1 to 2 hours, a number of them. And it was a Chinese oil and gas company and their UK based leaders that I was working with, who were their teams were very diverse. And one of the leaders in one of the reflections said, we've been talking about the CQ strategy piece, that ability to think about our assumptions, to check our awareness. And he said at their weekly team meetings, he used to finish kind of going, okay, do we all understand? And we're ready to go, off you go kind of thing. And he said he changed to do a kind of check on comprehension. And from that very first week, the incidents that would take place during a week, typically we'd be like, why on earth did you do that? We agreed whatever on Monday. So the critical incidents or the incidents reduced immediately because suddenly he realized that in this diverse group, or I suspect any group of people, we pick up different understandings. So using time to slow down the meeting instantly saved him an enormous amount of time later on and made things run more smoothly. So that bit about communication, and I think the bit is when you have a regular issue or something that keeps repeating, not as ideally as you would like to, that's a really good sign to maybe just pause and think, okay, what's going on here? How could I use cultural intelligence to enhance what's happening here? And so there's a couple of things going on there. It's about speed, how you use time, but also that question, do you understand? I hear that a lot in the UK. We're about speed with our questions. Do you understand? Yes, no. It's very direct. We assume. So when I'm doing training, I often ask people, what does yes mean? And there's lots of things it can mean, particularly the more diverse your cohort that you work with, the more meanings it can. And so that bit about how we use questions and check.
I think that's really interesting, Lucy, and we'll come on to diversity in a little while because what's running through my mind there is even if you have what looks like a fairly similar set of characteristics on the outside within your team, culture is so diverse based on our upbringing and everything that feeds into that, isn't it? So we'll cover diversity in a little bit. Um, okay, so many HR processes are designed with the intention of being fair and consistent. That's very important for us working in HR. But where do you see cultural assumptions unintentionally influencing those processes? So, for example, recruitment, performance management, or promotion decisions.
Thank you, Rona. And I think I'll focus on recruitment again, just for keeping us in the an example. And I noticed Nina had shared values when you were asking about culture. And often as societies, as groups, we don't really think about where our values have come from or we forget it. So that bit about developing our knowledge. So one of the things that comes up in recruitment, I find, is our preference for I over we. So where you brought up with that idea of independence and speaking your own mind and these different things, or where you brought up more with a we and interdependence and preserving harmony, and that may impact. So I look back to when I was doing quite a bit of interviewing with the British Council, and I look back with a degree of shame because I realised that we often interpreted when people spoke about we is people not being able to articulate their individual contribution. Whereas now I realise actually that's a cultural framework. And the people who are using we are thinking, what can't you understand about what's been done here? Often. And for me, it was often young women. I think men and women are often socialised differently in terms of how they might present themselves. But when we go forward, we can look, most of the world is more collectivist, so if you're of Asian, African, South American descent, you will be more likely to be we orientated. And it's something I hear quite a lot in feedback. So an example I give in the book is working with the NHS down in England. And they'd had a nurse acting up in a nurse management role for quite a while before the substantive role became available. And they thought she would get it. She'd been doing great in her role. But during interview, she spoke to we. And someone they didn't know spoke to I. So in the marking system, the I scored higher. It was that's what they wanted to hear. This woman was a Black woman, so it reinforced a kind of idea that the organization is quite racist because they couldn't hear different cultural values and interrogate them differently because the other person got the job because they were following fair systems. But all our systems come out of culture. And so for me, there's something about, do we know where culture has impacted this? And how does that impact in fairness and aspects like that? So a few weeks ago, I was working with a number of employers in Scotland, and many of them had data to show that in terms of applications that were diverse, they were getting applications, but that wasn't transferring into people in posts, or if people were getting into posts, it wasn't transferring into progression. And so there's lots of things I feel within HR And one of the things about HR is also people often think it's that group over there. So it's how do we embed some of the thinking organizationally? Because often it's not HR that do the interviews, for example. It's organizational. So there's different things going on for things like recruitment. And I think cultural intelligence is one of the lenses that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and at first it might seem quite frightening. You think, how are we supposed to know all the different cultural norms? But it's starting with that awareness, isn't it? Yeah.
Nobody, absolutely nobody can know all the cultural norms. And they keep changing. So things like our young people, what they've lived through is quite different, just in terms of communication. So they're joining a workforce with different expectations around communication and boundaries around, so our societies are always changing. Media around us, what we absorb. So we can't know everything, even in our small context. I don't know everything about Glasgow. I've been here for over 20 years, but there are lots of facets of the city I would claim to have no idea about culturally about. So it's taking on the world. But what we can do is know ourselves, know what shaped us, and know when we're having issues on repeat, that we maybe need to look at things differently. So that would be maybe the three things that I would take there.
That's really, really interesting, actually, and kind of links into more about bias as well. So, when organizations talk about bias, most of what we hear is the conversation focusing on unconscious bias training. But how does cultural intelligence address the issue of bias and improve decision making? So you've started alluding to that, but can you build on that, Lucy?
Yeah, I think I've been asked quite a number of times to deliver training on unconscious bias, and I've always resisted. And I kind of almost feel it was like a fashion. But when you looked at the academics behind, not that unconscious bias doesn't exist, it does. But when you look at the impact of training, it's often either zero or negative. So individuals can sometimes take away, but however, I do deliver training around CQ your bias. So how do we mitigate bias? And it's thinking about some of the assumptions that we have about things. So I'll maybe just ask if you could maybe launch a poll, Rona, just to see it's an agree, disagree poll, just to get some thinking in the room. So we've got one here, diversity in teams leads to innovation. And it's agree, disagree. And again, I know that you're all intelligent people and you're going, there's nuance, Lucy, and there's caveats, but we'll maybe discuss afterwards.
We're not far away already. We've got 22 out of 30. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think that's probably everyone there. A very clear result there.
Oh, is there? Interesting.
So, yeah, not sure if you can see the result, Lucy.
Not yet. Oh, I can't. Oh my goodness, we've got 100% going for agree. Interesting. Could I have someone maybe unmute? Is that possible that we can unmute and maybe share what their thinking was? Does somebody want to share with us?
Hi, Lucy. It's
Hello.
George.
Hello.
Um, why I said agree is I feel, with diversity, you've got all these different heads and ideas and everybody just, coming into one box and sharing. So yes, I do feel that diversity does mean innovation.
And you're getting a clap, I see, going up the side there as well. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing. And I think there's something there about what we believe. Where did this come from? And I'm often quoted, for example, McKinney, who have done reports around, diversity, but in leadership. Their reports are about leadership and diversity in leadership. And it's often been then assumed it's then all teams. And I work a lot with leaders, and often leadership teams are not reflective of the organisation and diversity of the organisation in which they work. So I'm going to say that if you have a very diverse leadership team, already you are an organisation that's quite different to maybe the higher percentage of organisations in the UK. And when you look at academic work in this question, one of the biggest metadatas is that diversity impact is about zero. And that's because either they take off exactly as you just said, you've got all these different thinking and it brings so many different ideas and perspectives, or it creates misunderstanding, breakdown in trust, and a kind of fallout. So you see, when you look at academic all around the world, a different picture. And there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles now on cultural intelligence, not here in the UK, which is quite interesting. Rona's saying this is a kind of new field. And the evidence shows that cultural intelligence is one of the capabilities that helps us work with that diversity. So the kind of tune of three on areas like productivity, innovation, profitability, that kind of thing, where you have diversity and cultural intelligence, then you can use. If you don't, you can have breakdown. And I'm sure many of us have been in teams that should have been great, but haven't been. So I think that's one of the things that makes it really important for the world that we live in, because the world is diverse. How do we harness it? And we're seeing a kind of lots of negative thinking about that in the media and politics and globally at the moment as well. So that bit about having something hopeful that we can counter, I think, is really useful.
Thanks, Lucy. There's so much in there. Was there something you were wanting to add there?
One of the small things I also wanted to add was maybe, is that word bias always the most useful word? I think within HR and the work I do, I'm very comfortable with saying I have bias. I know that we all do. I think sometimes when we take it into organisation, it creates defensiveness and people stepping back and people not really engaging. So sometimes I work with the language of assumptions, for example, or I was working with an organisation and about recruitment and, asking questions like, what does this recruitment panel have in common? Where are you different? What are your ideas of who would be great for this role, or an absolute no, what kind of traits? And that created different conversations that people went defensive about. And one group was saying, we noticed that we're all the same age. And we had asked people to do a presentation, all the people under whatever age it was, 35 or whatever. None of them gave out a handout. All the people over did. And we were all over the age of 45. We preferred a handout. But just having had that conversation, they suddenly thought, yes, but what was the content? That I had, and they did go on to recruit someone who hadn't given them a handout when they began to look at content and performance and these kind of things. But so having these conversations in ways that help develop without people go, I think it's quite difficult for people to come together sometimes, depending on who they are, to go, oh, this is where I'm quite biased, or this is where I'm not. But to say this is where we're quite similar. This is where we're very different. That these are so I think again, think about impact on people, not just that bias exists.
That's a great takeaway because I agree. I feel like bias has a negative connotation, like you've done something wrong. But bias is everywhere, so it's
Yes.
reframing it using different language. So it's a great takeaway, Lucy. So we've talked about leadership a little bit in there. So what does culturally intelligent leadership look like in practice? So are there specific behaviors or habits that leaders who are strong in cultural intelligence actually demonstrate?
I'm going to share another quote by Edgar Sheen, who does a lot of work on organisational, and he says the only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture. And if you do not manage culture, it manages you, and you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. And therefore, I think for leadership, that idea of what culture are we creating? What behaviors am I valuing, or bad behaviors am I tolerating? All these kind of things are really important for leadership. And again, some of the research is suggesting that CQ for leaders that are in multicultural, complex, maybe dealing internationally, that CQ is more important than IQ and EQ in terms of successful leadership. So I would really like to see more cultural intelligence coming into leadership development programs. And it seems to me that one thing is perspective taking. If you have mantras about what good leadership is that you hold on to, have a thought about where that works and who it works with. And wherever we are, we want to be leading everyone well. We want to be getting to a scenario where everyone thrives and contributes. So that would be that perspective taking, I think, is really important for leadership.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of, we always talk about being able to dial up and dial down as well. So what you're referring to there is if a leadership style might work for most of your team, but actually there's some team members where there's a bit of a rub. And so you maybe need to flex a little bit with your leadership style for that person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even moving sectors sometimes as well, you hear people going, oh, how I was a leader there just doesn't work in this
Yes.
different context, sector, or whatever.
Yeah. And that awareness as well, and having it's almost like you're talking about they need to have a pause every now and again to look at what's going on culturally within their team or organization. And we often get feedback or requests about doing a culture project, but it's a continuous thing for leadership, isn't it? That they need to be thinking about it, maybe not every single day, but regularly taking temperature checks.
Absolutely. And I think often I hear that we need culture change. And it's such an abstract term. It's what do we mean? And I think often it's not about, there's an awful lot of talk about identities and that we think of, culture out there. But that thing about what are the behaviours that are enabling this issue to manifest and what's keeping that going. So I think that talk about culture change, ideally, but it has to be made less abstract. It has to be, there has to be, and so that bit about looking in, I think, is about, so what are the behaviours that are going on here? and how do we support change? Because change is difficult, that CQ action piece. Even if any of us have thought about, doing a diet or a fitness regime, even if we know it's good for us, it's hard to do things differently.
Yeah, loads of food for thought there. So I mentioned linking with our last webinar. So we ran one looking at managing conflict in the workplace. And many workplace conflicts are not really about the issue that's being discussed, but it's about different expectations or communication styles. So how can cultural intelligence help leaders recognise and resolve these situations more effectively?
I really enjoyed listening to Dorothy at your webinar last month. It was super useful and lots of practical tips. And one of the things that struck me when I was thinking about cultural intelligence is that first piece, the CQ drive, our motivation to even want to work well with diversity. And part of that is confidence. Part of what gives us drive or motivation is our confidence to be in that context. And what I hear on repeat in organisations is we would never have got to this scenario of the grievance or tribunal if we'd started a conversation about a year ago or whatever, and it's often then what I hear is I just wasn't really confident in talking to Rona because, Rona and I are very different in terms of what we or whatever, so it's kind of people don't start the conversations. So I think that's part of why building our repertoire, you talked about dial up, dial down, so that bit about creating tools is really important. And cultural intelligence is a development tool, but I also use it as a planning tool. So for example, I've used it as an approach, a framework when I've been in conversations with people who have their union rep at their side, which we know is a kind of not an ideal scenario. But I find that framework of what's our motivation, what would better look like, what do we know about what's going on, what do we assume, who else do we need to talk to, how we are checking our assumptions, that piece, which I think is often missed out. And then action, what we're going to do, what we're going to commit to doing, and how will we make ourselves accountable. So one of the models that Dorothy had shared was the Deal Plus, and I kind of layered, it's a 4-part, and I layered cultural intelligence on, so I will share that so you can share afterwards, because I think often thinking about culture enables us to have impact with more people in more different contexts. And when I use the word culture, how are we, I'm talking about groups. Your quality assurance people will be in a totally different mental framework to your salespeople, for example, often. So it's how do the groups get us thinking about how we do things around here?
That's excellent. So, often in HR we talk about managers perhaps having jumped the gun. So this is where the cultural intelligence tool can be really useful. It stops that happening. Excellent. Okay. So from an HR perspective, that's really important for us. So what are some practical ways that organizations can start embedding cultural intelligence into systems and processes rather than just treating it as a one-off training topic that you go and learn about one day and come back and you've ticked that box?
Yeah, please don't do it as a tick box exercise. Absolutely. Although I would also say don't be shy of training. One of the things about cultural intelligence that I really appreciate is that you can get assessed in it. So, I do assessments with teams and you can see where you are as a team as well as an individual, as long as the team's more than 10 people. And it really made me look at myself differently when I first got involved with CQ back in 2013. You know, I'd been working with the British Council. I'd worked with people from over 80 countries. When I started my own company in 2010, I wanted to keep that international piece. So I thought my CQ drive would be high. It was okay, but it wasn't, you know, amazing. And it really got me reflecting differently. It got me thinking, do I only like diversity when it's kind of like me? And that's a difficult question. And it's one that led to different understandings about where I'm comfortable or uncomfortable. So I've been able to, you know, expand my ability to be constructive in more contexts and with more people. So I would say don't dismiss training, but I think little and often is often more useful than a day in a way. You need to think about how you're going to embed. So things like peer group coaching, you know, even something simple like reading groups, you know, that are free to put in and all these different things. And again, looking at what systems you have and how they're impacting. So where are some of the things that you think, we need to look at this maybe from a different perspective and consider it? And that can be a really useful way for thinking about what you've got, as well as thinking about what training you're doing. Often I don't do CQ just as a standalone. It'll be linked with something else that an organisation is already familiar with. So where are some of the points in this that you can bring it in where there's familiarity? And that helps with embedding from an HR perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think what's going through my mind, your example about the different cultures between sales and I think it was in
Quality
quality
assurance, I think, came
assurance.
out of my mouth that time.
Yeah. So that's a really great example because when you're rolling things out in an organization, you know, there is quite an HR mindset. And it's only when you start to work in different sectors that you really see the different styles of communication, even between the sectors, not just departments within an organization. And so introducing something, getting feedback on it from another team that has a very different culture could be really useful. And that gives you feedback on, are there any assumptions being made there?
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thinking more about practical advice, because that's really what is great for our audience to take away. So for any HR leaders or managers listening today who want to go away and start strengthening cultural intelligence, what is one practical step that they could start with tomorrow?
I think earlier, Rona, you mentioned we just need to take a pause. And I am a big advocate of just taking a deep breath into the bottom of your stomach. And it feels like forever, but it creates that opportunity to be proactive rather than just that gut reaction where often, you know, it's in high stress, time poor, which many of us are, that's when it's hardest to access cultural intelligent responses, you know, and so that breath just slowing us down and thinking there's different things. So I'm aware of things like I can hold a lack of trust for much longer than I used to. You know, I thought I don't really trust you. Whereas now I can hold a lack of trust and think we're seeing things differently. How can I understand this? And it's led to some super opportunities being able to do that. So it's that breath that lets us recognize what our discomfort is so that we can maybe, you used the word reframe earlier as well. So I would say a big advocate of the pause. And if I can give a second, I would also say I've interviewed people around the world. They were amazing. I started confident. I finished with a really deep sense of just a deeper sense of having interviewed people for the book Cultural Intelligence and Practice. So I'm maybe just going to say, it's a good read. I've had some good feedback on it.
Excellent. And yeah, as you're going through there, so the pause, it's reflective practice. And I think you mentioned before asking what's really going on here. So maybe having a set of questions, what's really going on here? You mentioned, testing your own discomfort, rather than just rushing ahead. So that's really good advice, Lucy. And absolutely look at your book as well. So there's so much information out there, and I think having a book that condenses the concept and makes it a bit easier to read is great. Okay, well, we have 10 minutes left. We would like some feedback. So just before we go into the questions, I'm going to share my slides again, and that'll give our QR code. And then we can see what questions have come through the chat. Let's see. Okay, so can you see a QR code there now? Fabulous. Excellent. And Lindsay, if you can come in, have there been any questions in the chat?
Hi, I can't see any. People were obviously very much getting involved with all your questions at the beginning and all your, asking them things. So, but oh, here's one just came in. There we go, just this minute. So, one from Katie: what resistance do you typically see from participants, and how do you address it?
Thank you, Katie. And I think that can depend on what has prompted training. Is it a response to something negative that's happened? And then I quite often go into rooms and you see everybody with their arms crossed and their shoulders up, feeling kind of anxious. And one of the things about one of the things I would say is it's really useful to have a specific issue that training addresses, as opposed to just too abstract. So if you are looking at something, it's useful. One of the things about CQ is it's about developing capability. So it's not about going in and saying this is, you've been bad kind of thing, that this isn't working. It's about finding solutions and opportunity. And so I often find, even although I'll go into rooms sometimes, that people relax and engage because they can see there's hope, there's something that can come from it that's useful for them. And just in any group, you have a spectrum of people who are very love anything that's developmental, and people who see it as a punishment for not having been good enough at something. And you've just got to kind of work with groups that you're with. So there are different things for resistance, but people do respond, I have found, generally, and sometimes in quite interesting ways, or what changes people. I think also sometimes I've heard people think it's quite American, or they've done other training that they feel isn't rooted. I do quite a lot of work with universities. They've done, so they might have done lots of training that's not rooted in academic research, but when they find it is, I've had people in academics kind of relaxing and thinking, all right, okay, this wasn't invented on the back of a sheet of paper in somebody's office somewhere. So I think that's appreciated as well in some of the spaces that I find myself in. And I noticed we had colleges and universities when I was seeing who was coming into the room at the beginning. And resistance can also come from things like time. I am time poor. So I think how things are developed in that kind of context is really important as well.
Thanks, Lucy.
I'm not seeing any other questions there, but I did have one more as well. We've got 5 minutes left, so you get a bonus question from me, Lucy. And thinking, obviously, you've spoken to all these people who have so much experience in the field to write your book, and you mentioned that you'd come out of it, having learned so much personally as well. So can you talk us through, what insight or what example really changed the way that you think about leadership or organizational culture from when you did your interviews?
I think for me, it wasn't so much the differences that surprised me as the similarities. So I spoke to people in Africa, America, Asia, Australia, Europe, Eastern Europe. And what was clear is that there are many ways to reach the same problems. So, for example, maybe that sense of HQ not really listening or understanding the context that they're going into, kind of idea. A bit like almost in a bigger way, the way you talked about HR, maybe putting things that land differently in different aspects of an organization, because we've maybe not thought about the different elements. So it was sometimes the similarities. It seems that we have that humanity. We keep reaching the same problems in different ways. And we have similar ways of, I think CQ gives us a framework. It doesn't change once you have the framework. You can keep layering in learning, and I find that very hopeful and optimistic. And as you said, Rona, the big element for me, I've been working in CQ for 13 years. I'm one of 10 master facilitators in the world in this field now, which I can't quite believe. So I was surprised talking to these experts around the world, as I say, how much commonality. They worked in different contexts for different purposes. Some of them for inclusion, some of them for relocation. So, they had leadership development, academia, they had different purposes, but there was a rich seam of similarity coming through.
That's really interesting. And, it's almost like if we're not culturally intelligent, then it's that sense that the way that we do things is the right way, and that's the only way. So if it's not that way, then it can't possibly be right. So becoming more culturally intelligent opens you up to, well, actually, there is a different way of getting to the same place, and that's okay if it's not the same way as I would do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So much going through my brain just now. And obviously, I would say to the audience, this is an introductory session. There's so much more that you could cover. Lucy, you've mentioned the framework. We haven't gone into each level in detail, so maybe that's for a future webinar. We'll see what the audience think. But just want to thank you so much today for your time and for the audience engagement as well. Unless anyone else has any other questions before we finish, then we'll close off the webinar and leave you to the rest of your day. So thanks again, Lucy.
Thank you. I've very much enjoyed your questions, Rona.
Thank you, Lucy. Been good.